Bianca Ferraro thought she'd planned the perfect joke. Her stepson, Philippe, was 37, cold as winter steel, and the most feared mafia boss in New York, a man who ran half the city's waterfront and hadn't once been made a fool of. So at a lavish dinner in front of the most powerful families in the city, she stood up with a smile and introduced the special match she'd personally arranged for him. Haven Hart, a poor, painfully shy, 27-year-old waitress from a small Brooklyn diner, a girl who'd been deaf since she was 9, standing in a borrowed dress in a room full of strangers, with no idea she was the punchline. The laughter started rolling exactly the way Bianca wanted it to. And then Philippe rose from his chair. What he did next silenced that entire room in seconds, and left every guest, every rival, and Bianca herself staring in absolute disbelief. Because there was one thing about her stepson this woman never bothered to learn, and that one thing was about to turn her cruel little joke into the biggest mistake of her life. If you've ever been laughed at by people who thought you were nothing, stay with this story until the end, because nobody in that room saw this coming. If this story touches your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs it today. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one, and drop a comment below to tell us where you're listening from. Now, let's go back to where it all began 2 weeks before that dinner, in a small Brooklyn diner where a girl named Haven was about to receive an offer that seemed too good to be true. The bell above the door of the little diner on a Brooklyn street rang for what must have been the 100th time during the evening shift. But Haven Hart didn't know, because she had never heard that bell. She saw only the warm yellow light spilling through the window, clouded with steam, the mouths opening and closing around the dining tables, and the customer at table number 4 snapping his fingers impatiently in her direction. He had called for her 3 times, or so she guessed from the angry red flush on his face, and when she approached with her order pad in hand, he turned to the man seated beside him and said, slowly enough for her to read every shape his lips made, "What's wrong with this girl? I've called her over and over, and she hasn't answered. How can someone this slow work as a waitress?" Haven kept the smile on her face, the smile she had practiced since she was 9 years old. The year meningitis swept through her body and carried away every sound in the world. The rain, the radio, even the sound of her mother singing in the kitchen. She placed the pad on the table and pointed to the sentence she had written in advance. "I'm hearing impaired. Please look at me when you order." The customer glanced at the note, curled his lip, then turned and spoke to the whole table as though she were an empty chair. "Forget it. I'll call another girl and get this done faster." He spoke straight through her, in the most literal sense, his gaze sliding away from her face as though she weren't standing there, and Haven had grown so accustomed to that feeling that it no longer struck her with sharp pain. It only ached quietly, like an old bruise pressed in the same place every day. She lowered her head and wrote down the order, then delivered every item exactly as requested, remembering the thin slice of lemon, remembering the sauce on the side, because she had learned to make up for her ears with her eyes, and her eyes missed nothing. But accuracy couldn't save her from the manager. He pulled her into a corner of the kitchen and spoke quickly, his face tight with irritation, forcing her to stare at his lips just to keep up. "Customers have complained about you 3 times this month," he said. "I don't care whose fault it is. This place needs people who can move fast. Let it happen one more time and I'll take away your weekend shifts, and you know exactly what that means." Haven did know. It meant the bill folded into quarters inside the pocket of her apron, an old hospital bill from the years when her mother had been sick, a debt the hospital had turned over to a collection agency, 1 letter every month, each letter carrying a number large enough to keep her awake at night. Her father had left early, and her mother had struggled to raise her until Haven was 19, before she, too, finally let go, leaving her hearing-impaired daughter with a miserable rented apartment, a debt in the 6 figures, and a world without subtitles. For 8 years, Haven had kept herself afloat in that world, with no family, no college degree, only the hands that carried trays and a mind forever trying to guess what the person in front of her had just said. The only reason the diner remained a place she wanted to return to every afternoon was Pearl, the 70-year-old woman who sat behind the cash register, the former owner of the diner before she sold it to someone else, though she had never given up the habit of coming in each evening. Tonight was no different. When Pearl saw Haven emerge from the corner of the kitchen carrying a tray, her shoulders sagging beneath a weight no one else seemed to notice, she didn't ask a question. She simply pushed a cup of hot tea toward her, along with a handwritten note in large, careful letters. "Don't let people who don't know how to see make you forget what you're worth." Haven read the note twice, folded it, and slipped it into her apron pocket beside the bill, as though the two pieces of paper might somehow balance each other. She looked up, ready to sign her thanks, when the diner door swung open, and she sensed the change in the air before she even saw the man who had entered, because everyone in the room had turned their head in the same direction. A man in his early 30s stood in the middle of the diner wearing an expensive wool coat that didn't belong in this neighborhood, a gleaming watch catching the light beneath the cheap fluorescent fixtures, looking like a crisp new banknote dropped into a basket of loose change. He said something to the waitress near the door. She shook her head and pointed toward Haven, and the man turned, revealed a brilliant white smile, and walked straight toward her. He pulled out a business card and placed it on the counter, tapped it lightly with 2 fingers, then spoke slowly and distinctly, shaping every word as though he had practiced beforehand. "You're Haven, aren't you? My name is Trevor Ashford. I have an offer I think you'll want to hear." Haven looked at the business card, then raised her eyes to the handsome, smiling face before her, and a cold feeling crept slowly down her spine. After a lifetime of reading people through their eyes instead of their voices, she immediately recognized what Trevor himself might not even have realized he was revealing. His smile was beautiful, but his eyes weren't smiling at all. That same evening, across a river and an entire world from the little diner in Brooklyn, Philippe Ferraro stood before a floor-to-ceiling window on the 40th floor of a Manhattan tower, looking down at the line of illuminated harbor cranes stretching along the waterfront. Half of that port operated under companies bearing his family's name, and the man trembling in the chair at the center of the room understood that better than anyone. His name didn't matter. He was a shipping partner who had quietly skimmed profits from 3 consignments in 2 months, confident that carefully polished figures on paper would be enough to deceive the Ferraro family. Philippe didn't shout. He didn't strike the table. He had no need for the 2 bodyguards standing motionless as statues beside the door. He merely placed 3 folders on the glass tabletop, slowly, one at a time, and each soft sound of paper touching glass made the man flinch as though he had heard a gunshot. Then Philippe spoke, his voice so low and even that the man had to hold his breath to catch every word. "I'm giving you 2 choices. The first is that tomorrow morning your attorney receives all of this evidence along with a lawsuit for damages that will bankrupt your company within 6 months. The second is that you sign over your share of the port contract at market value right now, leave this city, and never allow me to see your name on another document connected to these docks again." The man opened his mouth to explain, but Philippe's eyes passed over him only once, cold and direct as a blade placed upon a scale, and every excuse died in his throat. He signed. His hand shook so badly that his signature twisted out of shape, and when he finished, he didn't dare raise his head. A bodyguard opened the door for him, and he left it nearly a run, while Philippe never once moved away from the window, as though crushing a man deserved no more than a fraction of his attention. That was how all of New York knew Philippe Ferraro, the kingpin who never raised his voice, the man who made the hardest men in the city lower their eyes to their own shoes when he walked through a hallway. The man even his enemies admitted had never been deceived twice, because no one survived in their line of business after the first time. When only one man remained in the room, the door opened again, and Franco stepped inside, a 68-year-old man, with silver hair, combed straight back, and the upright bearing of someone who had stood beside 2 generations of Ferraro bosses. Franco was the only person in the city allowed to approach Philippe without warning, and the only one bold enough to place a cream-colored envelope on his desk without a word, then simply stand and wait. Philippe opened it and glanced over the card embossed in gold, an invitation to a family dinner on Saturday evening at the Long Island estate. Signed Bianca Ferraro, with a looping handwritten message beneath it. "It's time for this family to make peace again. I have a special surprise for you." Franco spoke first, his voice rough and cautious. "She has never hosted a dinner without taking something from it, sir. And this time she has invited every allied family, the financial circle as well, 40 guests. I've checked the list." Philippe set the card down, one finger tapping lightly against the word peace, a word that sounded almost obscene, coming from the woman who had entered the family after his mother's death, the woman who had stood beside his father during his final years with a perfect smile and eyes that were always calculating something behind it. His father had been gone for 2 years now, suddenly taken by a heart attack on an autumn morning, leaving his eldest son an empire and a hollow place no one had ever been allowed to touch. His mother, his real mother, had left this world 12 years ago, when Philippe was 25, after a long illness, leaving behind a hollow place no one had ever been allowed to touch. He kept no photograph of her in his office. He never spoke of her in any conversation. He had preserved only one thing: the room at the end of the hallway in the penthouse where he lived alone. A room locked for 12 years. A room even the housekeeper was permitted only to dust outside. Each evening, he ate at a long table set with a single chair, passed that closed room on his way to bed, and had never once stopped to place his hand on the doorknob. Franco remained where he was, waiting, until at last he asked directly, "You're going to refuse, aren't you?" Philippe looked out once more at the lights along the harbor, where his father's ships, now his ships, rested silently in the darkness. Then he picked up the invitation, slipped it back into the envelope, and gave an answer that made the loyal old man's brow tighten with concern. "No, I'll go. I want to see with my own eyes what that woman wants. Because, Franco, you know as well as I do that when Bianca invites half the city to witness a dinner of reconciliation, it means she has already built a stage, and I'd rather walk onto her stage than let her perform behind my back." The one thing Philippe couldn't have imagined was that the person Bianca had chosen to place on that stage beside him was, at that very moment, standing behind the counter of a diner in Brooklyn, holding the business card of a man whose smile never reached his eyes. Trevor Ashford pulled out a chair and sat down at the counter, without waiting to be invited, then presented his offer with the smooth confidence of a man who had rehearsed every word, speaking slowly, pronouncing each syllable clearly, and occasionally writing additional details in a small notebook before sliding it toward Haven, as though that display of thoughtfulness were proof of his good intentions. His family was hosting a grand dinner at a Long Island estate on Saturday evening, an event filled with distinguished guests, and his respected aunt, one of the wealthiest women in the city, was searching for a poised, observant, meticulous young woman to oversee the private reception at the main table, serving as a personal attendant at first, and then joining the dinner as an honored guest once the celebration began. The payment for that single evening would be $2,000. In cash. Before she left. $2,000. Haven read the figure on the page twice, feeling the folded hospital bill in her apron pocket grow almost hot against her hip. $2,000 was 2 months of wages at this diner. It was enough to pay 3 collection letters on time. It was 1 full month without lying awake until 2 o'clock in the morning, counting numbers in the dark. But she didn't pick up the pen to answer immediately. She raised her eyes to Trevor and wrote a direct question in the notebook. "Why me? This city has no shortage of professional event companies." Trevor's smile faltered for half a second, so briefly that anyone else might have missed it, but Haven had built her life around half-seconds like that. Then he wrote back, "My aunt once visited this diner and noticed the way you worked. She admired how attentive you were. She said girls who work with their whole heart are rare." The answer was sweet as honey, and precisely because it was so sweet, Haven sensed something beneath it. Wealthy people from Manhattan didn't cross the river to watch a hearing-impaired waitress arrange lemon slices. Her instincts told her that, instincts sharpened through 18 years of reading people through their eyes. She was about to write a refusal when Pearl, who had been sitting beside them and following the entire conversation, gently touched her wrist. The older woman took the notebook and wrote in her large, careful handwriting, "You're right to be suspicious. Life taught you to be, and I don't blame you. But Pearl is old now, and Pearl only asks you to hear one thing. All your life, you've stood outside the window looking into other people's world. Just for one night, take that money and pay down your debt. Eat a good meal. See what the world on the other side of the glass looks like. They're inviting you honestly, and you'll work honestly. Nobody gives something for nothing, but your labor has value. Don't let poverty teach you that there are doors you don't deserve to walk through." Haven read those lines for a long time, then looked at the bill in her apron pocket, looked at the manager glaring at her from the kitchen doorway, and finally picked up the pen and wrote 2 words, "I accept." Trevor's relief showed too quickly enough that it should have made her reconsider. He wrote down the address, explained the time, said a car couldn't collect her because she lived too far away, and gave her $300 for taxi fare, tucked inside the business card. Then he left the diner with the stride of a man who had completed the assignment he had been given. The days that followed passed in a strange mixture of uneasiness and a small glimmer of hope Haven didn't dare name. She owned no evening dress, and it was Pearl who opened an old cedar chest in her home and took out the midnight blue wool gown she had worn only once, 40 years earlier. She altered the waist by hand over 2 evenings, sewing while Haven sat beside her threading needles, telling her that beautiful dresses were like people, They needed only one person capable of recognizing their worth. On Saturday evening, a taxi carried Haven away from Brooklyn, across the bridge, through bright avenues, and onto a coastal road on Long Island, where the iron fences grew taller and the houses disappeared farther behind lawns as broad as public parks. When the car stopped before an enormous gate and the guard used his radio to confirm her name, Haven remained still for a moment, both hands clasped tightly over the borrowed fabric of her dress, reminding herself that she had come only to work, to do the job well, take the money, and return to her own world. The estate appeared beyond the bend, with 2 rows of golden lights lining the driveway, luxury cars filling the courtyard, and Haven stepped out, small and solitary in a 40-year-old dress among chauffeurs in suits, waiting for their employers. A woman dressed as a house manager was already waiting on the front steps. She didn't offer her hand or look Haven directly in the eyes. She merely motioned for her to follow, led her around the main hall where music and light spilled through the open doors, then into a small waiting room with a large mirror, where she indicated that Haven should sit until she was called. Haven waited there alone, staring at her reflection, a Brooklyn waitress in a borrowed dress, her heart beating so hard she could feel it trembling inside her chest. She had no idea that on the other side of the wall, 40 of the most powerful people in the city had already taken their seats, or that her name had been printed into a script she alone had never been allowed to read. Then the waiting room door opened. The house manager signaled that it was time, and Haven rose, following her down the corridor toward 2 towering wooden doors that were slowly opening, where the brilliance of the chandeliers poured over her like a golden waterfall, and dozens of unfamiliar faces turned toward her all at once. The banquet hall opened before Haven like another world, its ceiling soaring above 3 crystal chandeliers, rows of white-draped tables arranged around a marble floor, and 40 people in formal evening clothes turning their eyes toward her at once, faces she had never seen before yet, all wearing the same expression. One she recognized immediately, the anticipation of an audience waiting for a performance to begin. At the far end of the room, a woman in her 50s rose in a wine-colored evening gown, a glass of champagne in her hand, and Haven knew at once that this had to be the respected aunt Trevor had spoken of, Bianca Ferraro, with a strand of pearls at her throat, and a smile sculpted to perfection like everything else inside this estate. She began to speak, and Haven did what she had done all her life, fixing her eyes on those painted lips and reading every word they formed. First, the polished words of welcome, then the part Bianca called the special surprise of the evening, and with each shape of her mouth, the world collapsed beneath Haven's feet. Bianca was introducing her, not as an honored attendant, but as a gift she had arranged for the distinguished stepson seated at the main table, a special romantic match. And then those lips curved around words Haven had to read twice before she could believe them. Just a simple girl, a waitress from Brooklyn, and when you speak to the poor thing, please be patient, because she can't hear a word any of you are saying. Laughter. Haven couldn't hear the laughter, but she could see it. She saw shoulders shaking around the tables, hands rising to cover mouths, heads tilting together in whispers, eyes flicking toward her, and then toward the man sitting motionless at the center table. And she stood there, frozen beneath the pool of chandelier light in a borrowed dress that was 40 years old, finally understanding that she hadn't been invited there to work. She had been invited there to become the joke. $2,000, $300 for a taxi tucked inside a business card. Trevor's sweet, careful handwriting. All of it folded itself into a single truth, and the only thing Haven could still do was stand straight, because there was nowhere left to hide. The doors had closed behind her, and the room before her had become a wall of laughter she couldn't hear but could feel against her skin. Then she saw it, the change moving through the room like a cold wind. The shaking shoulders became still, the laughing mouths closed. One face after another turned toward the center table, because the man seated there had placed his napkin on the table and risen to his feet. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a black suit without a single crease, and what made the entire room hold its breath wasn't simply that he had stood, but the way those 40 powerful people fell silent at once like schoolchildren waiting to be punished, waiting for Philippe Ferraro's famous fury to descend upon someone, upon the woman who had turned the kingpin himself into the centerpiece of a cruel joke, or upon the girl from Brooklyn standing like a statue in the middle of the marble floor. Philippe didn't look at his stepmother even once. He walked around the table and crossed the open marble space, each slow, measured step falling into a silence that had become absolute, moving directly toward Haven. She lifted her eyes as the stranger approached, uncertain whether she should step back or remain where she was, seeing only his eyes, neither angry nor pitying, eyes that looked straight at her as though she were the only person in the room who existed. He stopped an arm's length away. Then, slowly, the most feared man in New York raised both hands to chest level. His fingers began to move, firm yet graceful, drawing into the air the language Haven had never once, in all 27 years of her life, seen anyone outside her own world use in a room filled entirely with hearing people. "Hello, I'm sorry for what this room has done. You're the only person here who has nothing to be ashamed of." Haven forgot to breathe. Somewhere at the far end of the room, the wine glass in Bianca's hand tilted, dark red wine slipping over the rim and falling onto the white carpet in a spreading stain no one bothered to notice, because every eye in the room was fixed upon the kingpin's hands, and the silence had grown so dense that a person might have heard the flames burning on the candles set in their silver holders. In the far corner, an old man with silver hair stood motionless beside the wall, his fingers tightening around the edge of a wine tray someone had pressed into his hands. Franco watched his young master's hands move, and something rose within his aging eyes, like a memory held beneath deep water for 15 years, finally breaking through the surface of the lake. Haven looked at the man standing before her, at the two hands that had spoken the kindest words she had received from a stranger in many years, and her own hands lifted almost without permission, trembling so badly that she had to pause for half a heartbeat to steady them before she signed her answer, one movement at a time. "You're the last thing I expected tonight." The corner of Philippe's mouth shifted, not quite a smile, only the first sign of life upon that frozen face. And he didn't know, none of them knew, that the moment when two pairs of hands found their voices in a sea of silent people was only the first piece to fall in a game that would stretch far beyond that night. A game the woman standing rigid at the head of the room with a half-empty wine glass would never accept losing on the very first move. Philippe lowered his hands, turned halfway toward the room that was still submerged in silence, and in a voice everyone there could hear clearly, he announced that the guest of honor that evening would dine with him at a private table, immediately. No one dared ask him to repeat himself. He motioned to the house manager, and in less than a minute, a small table was set beside the great window overlooking the illuminated garden, separated from the banquet tables, far enough away to offer privacy, yet close enough that all 40 guests were forced to watch the very person they had mocked become the most honored presence in the room. Philippe pulled out Haven's chair, waited until she was seated, and only then sat across from her. And the joke Bianca had spent 2 weeks arranging changed hands in 3 minutes, because no one in the room now dared look at the Brooklyn girl with the same expression they had worn before, not while she sat at the same table as the man before whom the entire city bowed its head. Haven sat with her back straight, and her hands resting in her lap, still struggling to recover from the earthquake that had just swept through her life, watching the man across from her as a question grew steadily larger inside her chest. But before she could ask it, a server approached their table, a young man in a white uniform with an order pad in his hand, and he did the thing Haven had endured more times than she could count throughout her life. He angled himself toward Philippe, spoke only to Philippe, and asked what Sir would like, and what the young lady accompanying him would like, his eyes passing over Haven as though passing over an empty chair, as though she had no mouth with which to order, and no face worthy of being looked at. Haven was so accustomed to it that she was about to lower her eyes and simply point at the menu, but Philippe's hand lifted slightly from the table, a small gesture that made the server freeze, and his voice rang out, low, level, and cold as glass. "You're serving 2 guests, not 1. Turn around, look at her, and wait for her to order for herself." The server went pale and turned fully toward Haven, looking directly at her for the first time, so flustered that it was almost painful to watch, while Philippe faced her and raised his hands, their movements becoming noticeably gentler than the voice he had just used. "What would you like?" "I'll tell him." Haven looked at the menu, then signed slowly that she would like the fish and a cup of chamomile tea. Philippe repeated every word, while the server wrote with both ears glowing red, bowed to her first and only then to Philippe, and hurried away as though escaping. It was a very small thing, lasting less than 2 minutes, but Haven sat there with a burning ache behind her nose, because in all 27 years of her life, this was the first time anyone had forced the world to stop and look at her as a complete human being, not out of pity, but because it should have been the most natural thing in the world. She raised her hands and asked the question that had been growing inside her chest. Why do you know my language? Philippe's hands paused for a moment before answering, and when they moved, his reply contained only 2 words. My mother. Haven waited for more, but no more came. His face closed like a door drawn gently, yet firmly shut, and she was perceptive enough not to press him. She only nodded, allowing the silence to rest between them like something fragile they had both agreed not to touch. But she noticed something he himself perhaps didn't realize, that 2 different men seemed to live within the same body. When he spoke aloud to the world beyond their table, every word was either a command or a calculated challenge. His jaw tight, his eyes like steel. But when his hands began to speak, something in his shoulders loosened. The hard lines of his face softened, as though this language flowed from a place deep within him that was distant and ancient, a place the outside world had never entered. At the head of the room, Bianca had returned to her seat at some point, her smile still fixed in place for the guests surrounding her, though her red-painted fingers tapped constantly against the stem of her glass. Then she rose, offered some excuse to the ladies at her table, and left the banquet hall through a side door. Through the glass panel, Haven briefly saw the woman stop in the corridor with a telephone pressed tightly to her ear, her lips moving urgently in words Haven couldn't read from that distance. Dinner continued. Philippe asked Haven about her work at the diner, and she told him about difficult customers and the kind former owner who still sat behind the counter every evening. He listened with his eyes and never interrupted, occasionally asking a question that made her realize he was truly listening rather than merely pretending to care. And in the middle of that magnificent banquet hall, filled with powerful people, 2 strangers spoke to each other in a language without sound that no one around them understood, sharing a strange kind of privacy in the heart of a crowded room. In the corner, Franco still stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, his eyes never leaving his young master's hands as they moved through the candlelight, forming gestures he had believed he would never see again in his lifetime. And when those hands completed another sentence that brought a smile to the face of the girl sitting across from him, the 68-year-old man had to turn away and lift one hand to the bridge of his nose, because some memories don't ask permission before returning to life, and some tears are not meant to be seen by the master a loyal servant has sworn to protect. The evening ended with a business card. Philippe handed it to Haven when he escorted her all the way to the car, his private telephone number written by hand on the back, along with one final signed sentence. If you ever need anything. Haven returned home with $2,000 in her wallet, the business card in the pocket of her dress, and a vague, weightless feeling she warned herself not to name, because girls like her weren't allowed to dream about men like him. She went back to work on Monday afternoon as though nothing had happened, planning to pay off 2 of the collection letters, buy Pearl a new wool scarf, and save whatever remained. But halfway through the evening shift, the manager called her into the corner of the kitchen, and this time he didn't speak quickly. He spoke slowly and clearly, almost savoring every shape his mouth formed. The diner is cutting staff. You've worked here a long time, but you receive the most customer complaints, so I'm letting you go as of today. This week's wages will be transferred later. Haven stood motionless. She wanted to write in her notebook that in 3 years she had never delivered a single wrong order, that those complaints came from people who snapped their fingers at her as though calling a dog, but she looked into the manager's eyes and saw not the discomfort of a man forced to dismiss an employee, but the smooth emptiness of someone who had already accepted his payment. And through the half-open office door behind him, she caught sight of a thick, cream-colored envelope on the desk, the kind of envelope that didn't belong in this neighborhood. She removed her apron, folded it neatly, placed it on the counter, bowed to Pearl, who was watching with her eyebrows drawn tightly together, and walked out of the diner that had kept her alive for 3 years without looking back, because she knew that if she turned around, she would cry. And she had promised herself at 19 that she would never cry in front of another person. The second piece of bad news arrived the following morning in the form of a letter pushed through the mail slot of her apartment door. Her landlord announced that beginning the next month, the rent would double because of a market adjustment, and anyone who disagreed would have 30 days to move out. Haven sat on the edge of her bed, placed the letter beside the hospital bill, then emptied her wallet and counted every dollar she had. The money from the banquet lay in a neat stack on the faded bedsheet. She counted it twice, worked through the figures on a scrap of paper, the new rent, the debt payments, food, and the final number gave her exactly 7 weeks before she reached the bottom. She didn't need anyone to explain what was happening. Losing her job and having her rent doubled within 2 days of dining with Philippe Ferraro weren't coincidences. They were an unsigned letter, and Haven read its message as clearly as she read lips. Stay away from him. You don't belong there. Philippe's business card was still inside the drawer. Haven opened that drawer 3 times that evening, picked up the card 3 times, and put it back down 3 times. One message was all it would take. That man could have her job restored within an hour. He could make her landlord fall to his knees and beg her forgiveness. She knew that. But it was precisely because she knew it that she didn't send the message. She had never asked anyone for anything in her life. Her mother had died poor and still repaid every cent she owed the neighbors. And if Haven asked Philippe for help now, she would become exactly what that woman wanted the whole world to believe she was, a little fortune hunter clinging to a wealthy family. No, she would rather wash dishes in 3 different kitchens. And so, in the days that followed, Haven rose at 6 o'clock every morning and walked through neighborhood after neighborhood handing out job applications. Every restaurant shook its head once they learned she was hearing impaired. Each evening, she still returned to the old diner and sat with Pearl at the corner table, not to complain, because she hadn't told the older woman about the rent increase, but simply because it was the only place left in the world where someone poured her a cup of tea without making her ask. Pearl watched the young woman straighten the stack of rejected applications, watched the worn heels of her shoes, and said very little. But one evening, when Haven went to the restroom, the 70-year-old woman quietly opened her cloth handbag and took out the business card she had retrieved from the trash behind the counter. On the day the manager threw away Haven's old belongings, a card bearing the name Philippe Ferraro and a handwritten telephone number on the back. Pearl studied it for a long time beneath the light, then slipped it into the pocket of her wool sweater, the way someone might put away a card that had waited many years to be played. On Friday afternoon, the diner door opened, and the man who entered brought the entire little restaurant to a standstill, a tall figure in a black overcoat, followed by an elderly man with silver hair, while 2 black cars waited at the curb outside and sent the neighborhood boys scattering. Philippe Ferraro searched every table with his eyes, failed to find the person he had come for, and walked directly to the counter where the old woman was sitting. In a voice that remained polite but couldn't conceal his impatience, he said he was looking for Haven. She hadn't answered him for several days, and the telephone number he had tried had been disconnected because the bill hadn't been paid. Pearl didn't answer immediately. She removed her reading glasses, wiped them slowly against the hem of her wool sweater, put them back on, then raised her eyes to the powerful man standing before her counter. She studied him for a long time, from his eyes down to his 2 hands, so long that Franco behind him had to clear his throat softly. At last, she spoke, asking a question that made Philippe Ferraro, a man who believed nothing left in this world could shake him, stand frozen in the middle of that worn old Brooklyn diner. "You're Adelina's son, aren't you?" "I've waited 15 years to ask you that." Philippe didn't ask how Pearl knew that name. He simply stood there, and Pearl pointed to the chair across from her with the familiar authority of a grandmother directing a grandson. "Sit down, young man. This is a story you should hear while seated." He sat. Franco quietly stepped back to stand beside the door, and the 70-year-old woman poured more tea into her own cup before she began, speaking slowly, like someone turning the pages of an old family album, one by one. 15 years earlier, when the diner still belonged to her, the brick building next door had been a neighborhood community center. It was poor, the roof leaked, the chairs wobbled, but every Tuesday afternoon, a woman came there. She was very beautiful, Pearl said. Not beautiful in the way of jewelry and cosmetics, but in the way that made a room grow solemn when she entered it. Her hair was always pinned neatly in a bun, her old wool coat was always pressed, and she couldn't hear. She never spoke with her mouth. She taught sign language free of charge to poor hearing-impaired children in the neighborhood, children whose families couldn't afford even one lesson at a specialized school. The woman introduced herself only as Adelina, with no last name and no address. She arrived by taxi and left by taxi, and Pearl was the one who carried coffee over to the class every week, so she remembered. She remembered everything. But most of all, she remembered one 12-year-old girl among those children, thin as a stick, who had lost her hearing 3 years earlier after an illness. Her family was so poor that no one had ever given her even one proper sign language lesson. For 3 years, the girl had lived like a shadow, without friends and without a voice. She sat curled into the farthest corner of the classroom and lowered her eyes whenever anyone looked at her. It was the woman named Adelina who walked to that corner, knelt until they were at eye level, and taught the girl the first sign she had ever learned. Then, week after week and month after month, Adelina drew that child out of her shadows with her own 2 hands, until one day, the girl dared stand before the whole class and tell a story with her hands, and the first person whose eyes she searched for was her teacher, the woman who had given her the words she would carry for the rest of her life. "Your hands are your voice." Pearl stopped and looked at Philippe, then asked very softly, "You know who that little girl was, don't you?" Philippe didn't answer. His jaw tightened, because at that exact moment, the diner door opened, and Haven walked inside as she did every evening, a stack of job applications tucked beneath one arm. She froze in the middle of the diner when she saw him, saw Franco, and saw the 2 black cars through the window, but Pearl waved her toward the table before she could turn around and leave. The old woman quickly wrote in the notebook she always kept on the counter and pushed it toward Haven. "Do you still have the gift your teacher gave you all those years ago, that brooch? Let me borrow it for a moment." Haven looked from Pearl to Philippe in confusion, unable to understand what was happening, but she opened the cloth bag hanging at her side and took out a small tin box with its paint worn away, something she had carried from apartment to apartment through all the years as though it were an identification document. From inside the box, she lifted a swallow-shaped brooch, its silver darkened by time, its tiny wings spread as though caught in the middle of a sweeping turn through the air. She placed it in Pearl's palm, and Pearl placed it in Philippe's, the hand of that man, the hand that had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars without allowing a single stroke of ink to tremble, the hand that had pointed at the most formidable men in the city without disturbing the rhythm of his breathing, stopped in midair when his fingers touched the little silver swallow. He knew that brooch. He had seen it 1,000 times throughout his childhood, pinned to the lapel of his mother's coat every Tuesday afternoon when she left the house without telling anyone where she was going. He had seen it in the black and white wedding photograph that stood above the fireplace, where his father, still a young man and not yet a kingpin, fastened that same swallow to his bride's dress, a wedding gift he had commissioned from a silversmith, because he said his wife was like a swallow, unable to sing, yet more beautiful in flight than every songbird in the world. For 15 years, Philippe had kept the room at the end of the hallway locked so he wouldn't have to remember, yet his mother had remained here throughout those same 15 years. Inside the chipped tin box of a Brooklyn waitress, inside the 2 hands that had signed to him in the banquet hall that he was the last thing she had expected that night, Philippe Ferraro opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He lifted both hands to sign, yet his fingers only trembled in the air before falling back to his sides. The most ruthless man in New York stood in the middle of the worn old diner with a silver swallow in his palm, rendered speechless in both languages he possessed. Haven looked at him, looked at the brooch, then looked at Pearl, and piece by piece, the truth came together in her eyes. Her teacher, Adelina, the woman who had returned her voice to her. My mother. The 2 brief words he had signed at the table beside the window. Haven's eyes widened slowly as one hand rose to cover her mouth. Pearl looked at the 2 young people standing silently before her and released a long breath, as though setting down a burden she had carried for many years. Then she spoke the final words of that evening. 15 years ago, she led that little girl out of silence. 15 years later, her son did exactly the same thing in the middle of a banquet hall. Mr. Ferraro, I'm old now. I don't believe in coincidences. I only believe there are debts of kindness heaven insists people repay, no matter how long it takes. And this one, it seems, has finally come due. That night, before leaving the diner, Philippe made the offer anyone in his position would have made. He knew she had lost her job. He knew about the rent increase. His people had uncovered everything in a single afternoon, and he signed plainly that she should let him take care of it, that an account would be opened and every debt would disappear before the end of the week. Haven looked at him, and her answer made Franco, standing near the door, raise an eyebrow. She signed slowly and clearly, every movement firm as a nail being driven into wood. Thank you. But no, I won't accept money I haven't earned with my own sweat. My mother died without owing anyone a single dollar, and I'm not going to begin now. If you want to help me in a way that allows me to hold my head high when I accept it. A long silence followed. Then the corner of Philippe's mouth lifted in that way that wasn't quite a smile, and he signed. All right, then listen to my second offer. My family's hotel in Manhattan needs a lobby coordinator. The previous employee left last month. It's a real position with real pay and a real interview. I'll tell the head of human resources to accept your application. That's all. Whether you pass or fail will be between you and them. I won't lift another finger." Haven studied him for a long moment, searching his eyes for some trace of an empty promise or pity wrapped in beautiful paper. She found neither. She saw only fairness, and she nodded. On Tuesday morning, she stood outside the Ferraro family hotel on a Manhattan avenue wearing the neatest clothes she owned, her application secured inside a stiff folder. The woman interviewing her was the head of human resources, a woman with salt and pepper hair and 30 years of experience who clearly had no intention of granting favors to anyone. She entered each question into a tablet for Haven to read, and the first one was as sharp as a knife. This position requires handling guest complaints, incorrect reservations, and urgent requests. How do you intend to manage those responsibilities when you can't hear the telephone? Haven didn't flinch. She opened her bag and placed her phone on the desk, with a speech-to-text application already running, followed by a notebook filled with prepared responses for 50 common situations, all of which she had compiled herself after 3 years of working in the diner. Then she wrote on the tablet, "I can't hear a telephone, but I can read a guest's face before they even open their mouth. Someone preparing to complain holds their neck stiff and taps a hand against the counter. Someone who needs urgent help begins searching for an employee with their eyes before they've even entered the lobby. In 3 years, none of my customers ever had to repeat a request, because I write everything down and I don't forget. Test me." The head of human resources did exactly that. She created 3 situations in succession: an international traveler whose luggage had been lost, a group arriving 2 hours early while their rooms were still being cleaned, and a gentleman furious over an incorrect bill. Haven handled each situation through writing and the application, efficiently and politely, always with a backup plan. In the third scenario, she even added that when a guest was angry, the fact that she wrote quietly instead of arguing often calmed them more quickly, because it was difficult for anyone to keep shouting at a piece of paper. The woman read that sentence and laughed aloud for the first time during the interview, and 3 days later, Haven received a job offer by email. The salary was 1.5 times what she had earned at the diner. The benefits were complete, and not a single line mentioned the Ferraro name. She stood in the middle of her cramped apartment and read the letter 3 times, then did something she hadn't done in 8 years. She opened the window, looked down at the Brooklyn street as its lights began to glow, and allowed herself to stand there laughing alone for a very long time. That same Tuesday night, across the river, on the highest floor of a tower overlooking the harbor, Philippe Ferraro stood before the last door at the end of the hallway in his penthouse. He had stood there many times over the past 12 years, never for longer than 3 seconds. But tonight he remained for a long while, the small key resting in his palm, the key he kept inside a safe beside the most important documents of his life. At last, the sound of the lock turning broke through the empty hallway, dry and hard, like a knock against his own ribcage. The room remained exactly as it had been when his mother was alive. The armchair beside the window, the reading lamp, the wool coat hanging behind the door, and the wooden shelves filled with yellowing books about sign language, the first books of his life, the first language he had learned, not on paper but through his mother's 10 fingers. He lowered himself into the armchair, took the book from the top of the stack, blew away the thin layer of dust, and opened it to a page covered with the awkward pencil marks of a 5-year-old child practicing how to draw the shape of a hand. The light in the room at the end of the hallway remained on until nearly 3 o'clock that morning, and had anyone been able to look inside, they would have seen a sight no one in New York would have believed: the kingpin who controlled half the harbor sitting alone beneath a reading lamp, his large hands patiently repeating gestures that had grown stiff after 15 years without use, slowly sharpening the first language of his life once again, not for a business deal, not for a struggle over power, but for the conversations he wanted to have with a woman who could read lies in a person's eyes. The only thing neither of them knew was that at a seaside estate on Long Island, the woman who had lost the first move was awake as well, and spread across the table before her was a collection of photographs taken from a distance. Philippe entering a diner in Brooklyn, Haven standing outside the gates of a Manhattan hotel, each image turned beneath the desk lamp by red-painted fingers that never trembled. Autumn passed over New York through a series of meetings that both of them called by the most ordinary names: a cup of coffee after her shift, a Sunday afternoon walk along the harbor, a dinner in the secluded corner of a small restaurant where no one recognized the notorious kingpin when he sat with his back to the door, and with each meeting, Philippe's hands began to change. During the first week, he still signed slowly, stumbling in places, sometimes pausing to search for a gesture the way someone searches for a word they haven't used in years. Haven corrected him patiently, never laughing when he made a mistake, simply repeating the proper movement very slowly and waiting for him to follow. By the 4th week, those hands moved as fluidly as though they had never slept for 15 years, and Haven even realized that he had begun to develop what she called a voice of his own, a style of signing that was concise, restrained, free of unnecessary movements, exactly like the man himself. In return, she taught him something that couldn't be found in any of the books on his mother's wooden shelf. She taught him how to be silent without being lonely. One afternoon, sitting on a bench overlooking the river, she signed that hearing people were always afraid of silence, that they hurried to fill it with every kind of empty word, but her world contained almost nothing except silence. And so she had learned that sitting beside someone without needing to say anything, while still feeling that nothing was missing, was the truest form of closeness. Philippe read every movement, then did exactly as she had said. He didn't answer. He simply sat there, and for the first time in his life, silence didn't weigh upon him like those dinners alone at the long table set with only one chair. It rested beside him lightly, like warmth drifting from the shoulder of the person sitting near him. One evening, after watching his 2 bodyguards move a crowd of reporters away from the restaurant entrance with nothing more than a look, Haven set down her cup of tea and asked the question she had kept inside for a long time. "I know what people call you behind your back. I know why that entire room held its breath when you stood up that night. Have you ever wondered why I'm not afraid of you?" Philippe looked at her and signed. "I have wondered." Haven answered with slow hands, every word falling clearly between them. "I've spent my whole life reading people through their eyes because I can't hear their lies. People are very good at lying with their mouths, but no one has ever been able to lie to me with their eyes. And in your eyes, from the very first night, I saw only exhaustion. I didn't see cruelty." Philippe's hands remained motionless on the table for a long while before he signed. "You're the first person to say that to me in 20 years. She smiled and replied, "Then for the past 20 years, you've only been meeting blind people." What happened next made the bodyguard standing 5 feet away turn his head completely toward them, because for the first time in all the years he had served Philippe Ferraro, he heard him laugh. It wasn't the cold curl of his mouth that appeared during negotiations, but real laughter rising from his chest, making his shoulders shake and taking 10 years from the frozen face the city feared. Haven couldn't hear that laughter, but she saw it, and she thought that of all the things she had ever seen in place of hearing, this was the most beautiful. But at night, alone on the highest floor overlooking the harbor lights, Philippe faced what the afternoon's laughter couldn't drive away. He knew exactly who he was. He knew what the people beyond those windows were willing to do to reach a weakness in the Ferraro family. For 20 years, he had survived because he had no weakness at all. No wife, no children, no one an enemy could seize. Now every afternoon spent beside Haven was another occasion on which he placed a hostage into the hands of the underworld with his own fingers. His world was a death sentence hanging over the head of anyone he loved. His mother had lived her entire life inside unmarked taxis and secret Tuesday afternoons, because his father had understood that truth, and now Philippe understood it too. On some nights, he picked up his telephone and prepared to write Haven that they should stop, that she deserved a life without a bodyguard standing 5 feet away. But then he remembered her hands telling him that 2 people could sit together without speaking and still feel that nothing was missing, and he put the telephone down, promising himself only 1 more week. Then that week became the next. It continued until the first Monday morning of November, when Franco entered Philippe's office without knocking, something he did only when the situation was serious, placed a printed flight itinerary for a private aircraft on the desk, and spoke in a voice that had fallen unusually low. "Sir, Bianca left New York on a private plane this morning. No one in the household was informed. Her destination was a small airport outside the city, where the Voss family has a registered hangar, and my men have confirmed that Elias Voss was already waiting there before dawn." Philippe read the flight itinerary twice, set it down, and asked the question a man like him was required to ask. What could Bianca possibly sell to Voss? She owns 30% of the shares, but she has no veto power. Every port contract is in my name. She has nothing to place on the table before an old fox like Elias Voss. Franco didn't answer immediately. The old man stood there with both hands clasped behind his back, studying his young master for a very long time. Then he did something that made Philippe frown. He pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting to be invited, something Franco hadn't done once in the past 2 years, and he spoke with the voice of a man who had carried something heavy for far too long. "Sir, There is something I've kept for 2 years. I promised myself I would reveal it only when I was certain. And this morning, when that aircraft landed at the Voss family airport, I became certain. He drew a small safe key from the inside pocket of his coat and placed it on the desk. And 1 hour later, on the glass table in the office overlooking the harbor, an old leather-bound file lay open, filled with the handwriting of Aurelio Ferraro. Franco told the story slowly and precisely, like a man giving testimony before a court. About 4 months before his death, the old master began to suspect something. 3 Ferraro shipments in succession were detained by customs, and every time, they selected the containers carrying the most valuable cargo, while Voss shipments traveling along the same route passed through with remarkable ease. That pattern wasn't bad luck. Information was being leaked, and port schedules detailed enough to make that possible were held by only 5 people. Aurelio quietly eliminated each of them one by one, until the list contained only one name, the name of the woman sleeping beside him every night. The old master couldn't believe it, Franco said. He ordered a deeper investigation, and his people uncovered what is inside this file. Documents belonging to an offshore shell company, registered under the name of an intermediary attorney. But when they followed the money, its expenses matched, day for day, the jewelry, the vacations, and even the secret Miami apartment Bianca had never disclosed to her husband. For 3 years, that shell company had received regular payments from an investment fund everyone in their world knew was Elias Voss's hidden reserve of unreported money. Philippe turned the pages one by one, his expression unchanged, but Franco saw the joints of his young master's fingers growing white against the edge of the glass table, and then he continued with the hardest part. The investigation was approaching its final stage. The old master intended to summon the family council at the end of that month and bring everything into the open. The date had been chosen. The people had been invited. But 3 days before the meeting, he never woke up. A heart attack in his sleep, the doctors concluded. At his age, with his heart, no one asked questions. There was a grand funeral. The entire city came to pay its respects, and the widow stood beside the coffin weeping so beautifully that the newspapers photographed her. The room remained silent for a long time, with only the distant horn of a ship rising from the harbor, and at last Philippe asked, his voice so low that the question seemed directed less at Franco than at himself. "Do you believe my father died naturally?" Franco looked directly into his eyes, and his answer was the answer of a man who had never spoken what he couldn't prove. "I don't know, sir. I've asked myself that question every night for 2 years. I don't have a single piece of evidence. The doctors may have been right. His heart was truly weak. But I know one thing. That woman gained everything from his death. She escaped the investigation. She kept her shares. She kept her reputation. And if you're asking whether I believe in coincidence, then you already know that at my age, I stopped believing in coincidence a long time ago." Then the old man lowered his voice, and what he told next was no longer a report. It was a memory. "Do you know how this entire world used to laugh at your father, sir? A man preparing to lead the family, yet he chose to marry a hearing-impaired woman with no name anyone recognized. They said every cruel thing behind his back. They called him weak. They said the Ferraro family would decline because of a woman who couldn't speak. One man even dared say it to his face at a dinner, and your father answered with only one sentence before walking out. He said, 'All of you have been able to hear your entire lives, yet you've never understood anyone. My wife can't hear, but she understands me with a single look. So which of us is truly deaf?'" Franco paused, cleared his throat, then finished. "I'm not telling you this to make you grieve. I'm telling you because for the past several weeks, I've watched you with that girl from Brooklyn, and I've seen my old master again so clearly that there have been moments when I had to turn away. That blood hasn't disappeared, sir. It has only been waiting." Philippe remained motionless for a long time, then closed the file, placed it inside a locked drawer, and when he raised his head, Franco saw that his young master's eyes had changed. They were no longer the eyes of a man who had just received terrible news. They were the eyes of a man who had begun a game. Put someone on Bianca from this day forward. Every meeting, every call, every document she signs. I want to know who she eats breakfast with and what time she goes to sleep. But Franco, listen carefully. She mustn't sense so much as a single hair out of place, because if she has ever done what I'm beginning to believe she did, then she is more dangerous than every man I have ever faced combined, and this time, she won't strike at me. She will strike at the softest place. Weeks after that secret flight, Haven received an official envelope delivered through the hotel management to the front desk where she worked, accompanied by a note from HR, stating that the late chairman's widow requested a brief private meeting. Inside was a handwritten letter on thick paper signed by Bianca Ferraro. The letter framed the lunch not just as a personal apology, but as a formal gesture to clear the air for Philippe's sake, so his family wouldn't remain divided. Haven read the letter 3 times during her break, and carried her uncertainty with her for 2 full days. She wasn't naive. She remembered exactly what those painted lips had shaped beneath the chandeliers. But this letter spoke in the one language against which an orphan had no natural bents, the language of family, because she knew she was stepping deeper and deeper into Philippe's life, and this woman, however terrible she might be, was still his father's widow, still a name that would appear at every Ferraro holiday and family gathering. And if there was even a 1% chance of turning the enemy of the man she loved into an ordinary person who could sit at the same table, wasn't one lunch worth trying? She asked Pearl for advice. The old woman studied the letter for a long time, then wrote, "I don't believe a snake becomes harmless because it sheds its skin, but I believe you're clever enough to have lunch with one in a crowded place. Go, hear what she has to say. Just don't drink anything she pours." The lunch took place at an elegant restaurant in the heart of Manhattan, where the glass windows overlooked the avenue and every table stood far enough from the next that no one could overhear another person's conversation. Bianca arrived before the appointed time, something unusual for a woman accustomed to making the entire city wait for her. And throughout the meal, she seemed like a completely different person. There were no proud pearls around her throat. She had dressed with a calculated simplicity. She communicated with Haven through a writing pad she had brought with her, her handwriting neat and careful, asking about Haven's new job, praising her determination, telling her about her own poor childhood in a small town before she married into wealth. And near the end of the meal, those perfectly lined eyes became red at exactly the right moment, and to exactly the right degree as she wrote, "I treated you the same way people once treated me when I was poor. That is what shames me most. Will you let me make amends for even a small part of it?" Then she placed a rigid black gift box tied with ribbon on the table. Inside was a cream-colored leather handbag from a fashion house Haven had only ever seen behind glass displays. Bianca continued writing, "Don't refuse it. It isn't a bribe. It's an apology, from one woman to another. A proper bag for your workdays, so that every time you carry it, you'll know there is an old woman on Long Island trying to learn how to be a good person again." Haven looked at the handbag, then at the woman seated across from her. She had remained guarded throughout the entire meal. She had drunk nothing except the glass of water she ordered for herself. But in that moment, her defenses thinned, because the gift came wrapped in a story of poverty that resembled her own, because the apology had been written by hand in real ink on real paper, and because deep inside her, the orphaned child she had once been still longed for an older person to admit they had wronged her, just once. So she accepted it, bowed her head in thanks, and never saw, couldn't possibly have seen, the brief glance Bianca gave the handbag as it changed hands, the look of a hunter checking a trap one final time, because that bag had spent an entire morning in the hands of Bianca's people before being placed inside the box, and what had been sewn into its lining wasn't an apology. During those same days, the machinery of New York's underworld was turning toward a single gathering. The Council of Allied Families had scheduled its major meeting for the end of the month to finalize the structure of port control for the next 5 years, a meeting in which every signature Philippe placed on paper would determine the fate of hundreds of millions of dollars, and like fish scenting blood in the water, Elias Voss's people began appearing more frequently around the Ferraro family's connections. A lawyer suggested a partnership at a charity gala. An unfamiliar investment fund inquired about purchasing a small block of shares. They were gentle probes, but Philippe recognized every one of them, and Franco recorded every name. Meanwhile, inside the car parked outside the Manhattan restaurant that afternoon, Trevor Ashford sat behind the steering wheel waiting for his aunt to emerge, and when Bianca opened the door and settled into the back seat wearing the smile of a woman who had completed her task, Trevor's gaze dropped to the second black box, still resting in her hands, identical to the one she had just given away. His hands tightened around the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, and his voice came out dry. "You're certain this can't be traced back to me, aren't you? The device inside that lining was purchased through my account. You said it would be used once, and then destroyed. You promised." In the rearview mirror, Bianca's painted lips curved into the smile Trevor had learned to fear since childhood. and she spoke exactly 4 words before signaling for the car to move. "Just drive the car." The council meeting took place on a late afternoon near the end of the month, on the top floor of the Ferraro family hotel, the very hotel where Haven worked, inside a sealed conference room on the highest level, with representatives of 6 allied families. Bianca was also present as the owner of 30% of the shares, sitting at the far end of the table, unusually quiet and submissive throughout the first 2 hours. Haven had nothing to do with that meeting. She only had a simple arrangement with Philippe. He had messaged her that the meeting should end around 6 o'clock, that she could wait for him in the top floor lounge, and they would go to dinner afterward. And so, at 5:45, the young receptionist received permission to leave the front desk early and rode the elevator to the top floor, with the cream-colored handbag hanging from her shoulder, the bag she had carried all week as a way of reminding herself that people could change. She sat on the sofa in the waiting lounge, placed the bag beside her, completely unaware that Bianca's assistant had personally escorted her past the primary ground floor security checkpoint using his high-level authorization pass under the pretext of guest accommodation. Everything erupted 15 minutes later, when that same assistant returned to the lounge, loudly claiming that standard VIP protocol required a secondary manual check before Philippe stepped out. The request sounded so reasonable that Haven nodded immediately. The assistant opened the bag and searched it casually, then suddenly stopped, pressed his fingers against the lining at the bottom, cut through the seam that had already been loosely stitched, and pulled out a flat black metal object, smaller than a matchbox. He immediately shouted for help. The conference room doors flew open, security guards rushed out, and within 3 minutes, the most powerful council in New York was standing around the table in the waiting lounge, where the metal device lay in the center, a specialized recorder still running, its red light blinking, having captured the full 2 hours of confidential discussion about the structure of port control through the thin wall. A security specialist from one of the allied families picked up the device and examined it, and his conclusion fell across the room like the blow of an axe. This model wasn't sold on the open market. It was custom-made, from the same line as 2 devices discovered in previous surveillance operations, and both incidents had been traced to the same source, people working for Elias Voss. Every pair of eyes turned toward Haven. She stood in the middle of the circle, still unable to understand what had happened, seeing only mouths moving rapidly around her. And she did what she had done her entire life. She read them. She read every shape of every word, and each one tore into her. The waitress, a spy, the Voss family, planted here, who brought her onto this floor. Then Bianca pushed through the crowd and stepped forward, and the performance began. The woman pressed one hand to her chest and swayed for exactly 1 beat so that 2 people had to support her. Then she spoke loudly, clearly, and slowly, and Haven understood at once that the careful pace was deliberate. Bianca wanted her to read every word. "My God, I've been such a fool. It was me. I brought this girl into our family with my own hands. You all remember the autumn banquet, don't you? I arranged her as a match for Philippe, as a cruel little amusement. I thought I had chosen some poor waitress at random. I never imagined she had already placed herself there, waiting for me to choose her. Don't you understand? The Voss family planted her in advance. They studied my son. They knew he would become vulnerable to a hearing-impaired girl because of his mother. My God, they even used the dead to build their trap, and I was nothing more than a foolish old woman they manipulated into becoming the bridge. I have sinned against my husband's memory." Then she cried, real tears rolling down her cheeks, the tears of an actress who had rehearsed before a mirror for an entire week, while every shape her lips formed pierced Haven like another needle. The room visibly wavered. Powerful, silver-haired heads turned toward one another. Some began to nod. Bianca's story fit together perfectly. A poor girl had appeared at exactly the right moment, won the kingpin's heart with unnatural speed, been hired inside the very hotel where the confidential meeting was being held, and now she was sitting directly beside the conference room with a Voss recording device hidden inside her bag. Every piece fit, because the person who had created the story had carved each piece in advance. Haven wanted to speak. She needed to speak. She stepped forward and raised both hands, signing rapidly and desperately. She gave me this bag. She invited me to lunch. She wrote me a letter apologizing. But the eyes around the room watched her hands move as though they were watching a foreign language no one cared to translate. Among 4 decades of power gathered inside that room, not one person had bothered to learn a single sign. She was screaming with both arms in the middle of a deaf world, And for the first time in her life, Haven understood what true voicelessness meant. It wasn't being unable to speak. It was speaking while no one cared enough to understand. Only one person in the room could read every word she said. Philippe stood at the head of the table, motionless since the moment the conference room doors had opened, his face without expression, carved from stone. As the murmurs swelled into pressure, the elder of the oldest family in the alliance tapped one finger against the tabletop, a single tap that silenced the entire room. He looked directly at Philippe and spoke the words the laws of their world had preserved for 100 years. Ferraro, we all know the law. Anyone who plants a listening device inside a council meeting has betrayed every family represented here, and a traitor must be dealt with according to that law. There are no exceptions. There is no gray area. The only question remaining is this. You must be the one to deal with her, because she belongs to you. We are waiting to see whether you choose that girl or the honor of the Ferraro name. Philippe didn't answer the elder immediately. He left the head of the table and crossed the breathless room, one measured step at a time, passing Bianca as she dabbed at her tears with a lace handkerchief without giving her even half a glance, then stopped before Haven at arm's length, the same distance that had separated them beneath the chandeliers on that first night, except that then he had approached to lift her up, while this afternoon, the entire room behind him was waiting for him to do the opposite. He raised both hands, and before 40 pairs of eyes that couldn't understand, he addressed her in the language only 2 people in that room possessed, slowly and heavily, each movement placed between them like a weight upon a scale. Look into my eyes and tell me the truth. Haven looked at him. She had stood inside that circle for nearly half an hour, had been called a spy by 40 moving mouths, had waved both arms into emptiness like a drowning woman. Yet at this moment, when the only person who understood her finally asked her to speak, her shoulders straightened instead of collapsing, and when her hands rose to answer, they no longer trembled. She signed with every movement clear enough to carve itself into the air. I didn't know what was inside the bag. The bag was a gift from that woman. But I won't stand here telling a pitiful story and begging you to believe me, because I want you to remember something. For 27 years, the whole world looked straight through me as though I were a pane of glass. You were the first person who saw me. You were the first person who made the world stop and look at me. So if even you can't see me now, then this world is exactly what I've always known it to be, and you should do whatever you must do. I won't blame you. Then she did something that silenced even those who couldn't understand the language she was using. She removed the cream-colored handbag from her shoulder and placed it on the table in the center of the room, gently, as though returning something that had never truly belonged to her. She stepped back and stood straight, her chin lifted, her arms resting at her sides, without a single tear or pleading gesture, a Brooklyn waitress standing before the 6 most powerful families in New York, with the bearing of the only person in the room who owed nothing to anyone. It was that refusal to beg that pierced Philippe more deeply than any defense could have, because he had spent 40 years among people who begged, and the guilty always begged best. The guilty came prepared with tears and stories, like the woman standing behind him, while the person before him offered only one thing, the naked truth without beautiful wrapping, along with the right to decide for himself whether he believed it. But the evidence was still lying on the table. The red light was still blinking. Bianca's story still fit together piece by piece, and 20 years of passing judgment in the underworld had taught Philippe one merciless lesson: that emotion was a luxury a man in his position couldn't afford to spend. He turned to face the council and declared, in a voice no louder than usual, though no one dared interrupt him, "The law is the law. I'm not asking for an exception, but the law also says that an accused person must be investigated before judgment is carried out. I place the honor of the Ferraro name as my guarantee. Give me 48 hours. After 48 hours, I will stand before this council with the truth, whatever that truth may be, and if I am wrong, I will enforce the law with my own hands. No one will need to remind me." The elder studied him for a long time, then nodded once. 48 hours, Ferraro, not 1 minute more. Haven read the entire judgment from the lips of both men. She looked at Philippe one final time, but he didn't turn back toward her. His face had closed into the face of the kingpin, and she understood. She bowed her head to the room that had already convicted her, then walked toward the door with steady steps, descended in the elevator, crossed the grand lobby while her bewildered co-workers watched her pass, and stepped out into the New York rain without stopping to put on her coat. Back inside the conference room, Philippe stood motionless beside the table, holding the cream-colored bag, while the council murmured and began to disperse around him. Bianca was led toward the door by her nephew, wearing the broken posture of a devastated woman, and inside Philippe, two forces were tearing him apart. On one side, 20 years of experience shouted that every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction, that the most magnificent deceptions he had ever witnessed had always dressed themselves in innocence. On the other side were eyes that hadn't begged, and a sentence signed beside the river that kept returning again and again, refusing to fade. I've spent my whole life reading people through their eyes because I can't hear their lies. If she could read lies through a person's eyes, then why was he, a man who had won every game by reading people, afraid to trust his own eyes when they looked at her? Philippe pulled out his phone and called a single number. The moment the person on the other end answered, he spoke without greeting, in the voice of a man who had entered the final game. "Franco, cancel everything on my schedule. Bring me every security recording from this hotel, every floor, every corner, every hour from the past 7 days, along with the personnel file of every person who was present on the top floor this afternoon. I have 48 hours to find a snake, and I swear to you, this time I will follow it all the way into its nest." That night, the sign outside the Brooklyn diner had long since been turned off, but beyond the steam-clouded windows, a single yellow lamp still burned above the corner table where Pearl sat with Haven, the pot of tea between them gone cold, and neither of them bothering to pour. Haven didn't recount what had happened that afternoon. She didn't need to. News in the world she had just been cast out of traveled faster than rain. She simply sat in silence for a long time, then slowly opened the cloth bag at her side, took out the chipped tin box, lifted the lid, and placed the silver swallow in her palm, studying it beneath the light as though she were looking at something that had come to an end. She drew out her notebook and wrote in small, even lines. "I'm going to send it back. Please return it to him for me. It belonged to his mother, so it belongs with the Ferraro family. I don't. Standing in that room all afternoon taught me something. People like them have their own laws, their own language, even their own truth. All I do by stepping into it is break things further. Maybe I never belonged in their story to begin with." Pearl read every word and didn't answer at once. She removed her reading glasses, then did something in place of all advice. She reached out with both wrinkled hands, closed Haven's fingers around the swallow, held that clenched hand tightly between her own, and only then picked up the pen and wrote in her large, careful handwriting, "Look closely at this bird, child. It is tiny. It can't sing. Yet every year, it crosses an ocean, and no storm can stop it from finding its way back to the same old home. The woman who gave you this brooch taught you to speak with your hands when the whole world called you mute. She knelt in the corner of a classroom for a little girl no one else bothered to see. Do you truly believe that if a woman like her were still alive, she would tell you to return her keepsake and hide in Brooklyn? No, child. That woman never taught you to run away. She taught you only one thing, and it seems to me you're beginning to forget it." Haven read those lines, and without realizing it, her fist tightened around the silver swallow. She remained there for a long time, her eyes red but not a single tear falling, then placed the brooch back inside the tin box and tucked the box into her cloth bag, close against her heart. Pearl poured 2 fresh cups of tea, because neither woman intended to sleep that night. At that same hour, across the river, an entire floor of the Ferraro office tower blazed with light as bright as day. Philippe had transformed his private conference room into a command center. 3 large screens displaying footage from hundreds of hotel cameras, while Franco sat beside him with the personnel lists, and together they moved backward through time, 1 hour at a time from the fateful afternoon. The first clue appeared close to midnight. Hallway footage from the top floor showed Bianca's assistant, the man who had raised the alarm after supposedly discovering the recorder, passing through the waiting lounge 3 times that afternoon, glancing each time toward the sofa where Haven would later sit. No security officer patrolled as though waiting for something to happen. He hadn't been searching for a device. He had been waiting for his cue. The second clue appeared in footage from 5 days earlier. A camera in the parking area outside the Manhattan restaurant on the afternoon of the reconciliation lunch showed the black gift box with its ribbon being carried from Bianca's car into the restaurant, not by a restaurant employee, but by that same assistant. Before that, in a frame Franco had to replay 3 times, the box had remained inside the car all morning with a man seated behind the wheel, Trevor Ashford. The third clue fell like the final hammer. Philippe's technical team traced the serial number of the recording device, The specialized supplier had sold it through an anonymous order, but payment couldn't remain anonymous forever. The money passed through 2 intermediaries before ending at a secondary credit card issued under a bank account bearing Trevor Ashford's name. Franco placed the report beside Aurelio's old leather-bound file, which already lay open on the table, and both men saw it at the same moment, the chilling connection. The shell company in the father's file and the money trail behind today's recording device had used the same intermediary law office, with the same attorney's name, signed on documents 3 years apart. The snake hadn't changed its nest, it had only changed its prey. Philippe sat motionless before the 3 screens, and what rose inside his chest wasn't hot anger, but a stillness far more frightening, the stillness of a man who had finally seen the entire board, the person who had deceived his father, the person who might have been connected to his father's death, and the person who had just tried to use Philippe's own hands to punish the innocent woman his mother once saved, were all one and the same. He rose, looked at the clock, and saw that 29 hours remained before the deadline. More than enough. Then he gave Franco the final order of the night, his voice so calm it sent a chill through the room. Prepare an emergency summons for all 6 families in my name. Tell them I will present the truth exactly as I promised. The time will be 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. As for the location, Philippe paused, and the corner of his mouth lifted into that curve that wasn't a smile. The Long Island estate, in the same banquet hall with the 3 crystal chandeliers, where she once built a stage to humiliate someone else. I want her seated in the same chair beneath the same lights when her own curtain comes down. At 7 o'clock the following evening, the banquet hall of the Long Island estate was illuminated once again, 3 crystal chandeliers pouring golden light over the long table, where representatives of all 6 families had taken their seats. There were no white tablecloths, no wine, no music, only the silence of a courtroom. Bianca sat in the exact chair from which she had raised her glass on that autumn night, Trevor beside her with the bloodless face of a man who hadn't slept for 2 nights, while Philippe stood in the place where Haven had stood that evening, directly beneath the pool of chandelier light, as though he had deliberately chosen that spot so the room would remember whom it had once laughed at. He didn't begin with an accusation. He began with the small remote control in his hand, and on the screen prepared behind him, the truth appeared 1 layer at a time, cold and orderly, exactly as he governed his empire. The first layer was the security footage, Bianca's assistant, circling the waiting lounge 3 times to watch the clock, the black gift box tied with ribbon traveling from the trunk of Bianca's car into the Manhattan restaurant in the hands of one of her own people, rather than any employee of the restaurant. The second layer was the enlarged bank statement on the screen, the payment for the recording device passing through 2 intermediaries before ending on a credit card issued under an account bearing Trevor Ashford's name. And when that name appeared in clear letters, every person along the table turned at once. Trevor sprang from his chair as though burned, stammering that there had been a mistake, that someone had stolen his identity. But Philippe merely pressed the control again, and the third layer descended. Documents from the shell company inside the old leather-bound file, 3 years of payments from the Voss family's hidden fund, the same law office, the same intermediary signature connecting the recording device of the present day to the betrayal from 3 years earlier. Then Philippe spoke the first words of the evening, his voice as even as though he were reading official minutes. This file doesn't belong to me. It belonged to my father. Aurelio Ferraro assembled it with his own hands during the final 4 months of his life. He intended to present it before a meeting exactly like this one, a meeting scheduled for 3 days after the night he never woke again. The statement fell into the room like a stone breaking through the surface of a frozen lake, and every gaze turned toward the widow. It was at that exact moment, when every eye in the world Trevor Ashford had spent his life longing to enter fixed upon his table, that the nerves of the vain and cowardly man shattered. He whirled toward his aunt, and the words poured out beyond his control, loud enough to echo through the entire banquet hall. You told me I only had to bring that waitress here and turn her into a joke in front of the families, so no one would ever suspect you again. You never said my name would be exposed if anything went wrong. You promised no one would ever learn about the Voss family. You promised the device would be used once and destroyed. You told me to open that card account. Everything I did, you told me to do. Bianca hissed her nephew's name and ordered him to be silent, her red-painted fingers digging into the edge of the table, but a deep, cold voice cut through them both. No, let him continue. Philippe remained still beneath the chandeliers and allowed Trevor, panicking in his desperate attempt to save himself, to pull every final nail from his aunt's sinking ship, from the false matchmaking scheme he had been ordered to arrange, to the cream-colored handbag prepared throughout an entire morning, to the journeys he had made as her driver when she met with people from the Voss family. When Trevor collapsed back into his chair, breathing hard, no one in the room was looking at him anymore. Every eye was fixed on Bianca, the woman who had manipulated those same eyes for years with tears and pearls. She opened her mouth once, then twice, the mouth that had created so many perfect stories, but no new story would come. She simply sat there, her back straight from the habit of 30 years spent performing, while everything around her fell away piece by piece. And that silence, the silence of a woman who had no role left to play, was more terrifying than any scream. The elder rose and delivered the council's judgment in a few brief words. Bianca Ferraro was stripped of every position and privilege within the alliance. Every family present would sever all ties with her. From that night forward, her name would no longer be spoken in any room belonging to their world. Then he asked Philippe the final question. The rest will be handled according to the old law, won't it? The entire room held its breath, because everyone understood what the old law meant. But Philippe shook his head. He placed a sealed paper box on the table and spoke the only declaration of the entire evening. Inside this box are complete copies: tax fraud, shell companies, money laundering through 3 accounts. Tomorrow morning, the originals will be on the desk of a federal prosecutor. My father believed in the law of honor, and I respect that. But for her, I have chosen something she fears far more: the law itself. Federal prison has no lace handkerchiefs, and no amount of tears can purchase a jury. Furthermore, my father's medical files have been submitted for a full homicide reinvestigation, so she will answer for his sudden death as well. As for illegal assets, the government will seize every last dollar. At the far end of the table, the representative Elias Voss had sent as an observer quietly closed his leather case, bowed to no one in particular, and left the banquet hall. Everyone understood that language. The Voss family had just erased Bianca Ferraro's number and withdrawn from every negotiation. A fox never remains behind to bury an accomplice. Philippe stood looking at the woman who had lost everything inside her own banquet hall, and what he felt wasn't victory. It was an address in Brooklyn, where someone still didn't know that the entire world had finally acknowledged her innocence, and he still owed that person something more important than every judgment delivered that night. News of what had happened on Long Island reached Brooklyn the very next morning, not through the newspapers or whispered rumors, but through Pearl herself, who received a call from Franco at dawn and sat at the corner table writing every detail for Haven to read. She had been cleared before all 6 families. The person who had set the trap had been exposed. It was over. Haven read those lines in silence. She didn't cry out or burst into tears. She only remained seated for a long time with both hands resting face down on the page, then rose, put on her coat, and told Pearl with one brief sign that she needed to walk alone for a while. Her feet didn't lead her aimlessly through the streets. They carried her to one precise place, the narrow street beside the diner, before the old brick building that had been closed for years, the former community center where, 15 years earlier, an elegant woman had knelt in the corner of a classroom until she was level with the eyes of a little girl no one else had cared to see. Haven stood on the sidewalk looking at the faded wooden door locked tightly shut, the windows covered with boards, and she didn't know how long she remained there. She knew only that amid everything that had happened, this was the one place she wanted to be, like a swallow returning to its old nest. She didn't hear the car stop behind her. She didn't hear the approaching footsteps. She realized she was no longer alone only when another shadow stretched across the sidewalk beside her own, and when she turned, Philippe was standing there. He wore no black suit. There was no line of bodyguards behind him. There was only Philippe in a simple coat, dark circles beneath his eyes from nights without sleep, and several steps behind him, Franco and Pearl stood beside the car. Someone had brought the old woman there, and both of them wore the same expression, the expression of people who already knew what was about to happen. Philippe didn't sign a greeting. He didn't explain or recount the events of the night before. He simply reached into his coat pocket, took out a newly cut brass key, placed it in Haven's palm, then tipped his head slightly toward the faded wooden door. Haven looked at the key, then at him, still not understanding, until she climbed the steps, fitted it into the newly installed lock that still carried the clean scent of metal, turned it, and pushed the door open for the first time in all those years. Morning sunlight followed her into the large room, dust glittering in the angled beams pouring through windows from which the boards had been removed. Someone had cleaned the old wooden floor. New tables and chairs, still covered in plastic, stood neatly arranged along the walls. A large board hung in the place where the old one had once been, and Haven stood in the room of her childhood, turning slowly in a circle as her throat tightened, until her eyes came to rest on a wooden sign propped beside the door, waiting to be mounted above the entrance, its freshly painted words reading, "The Adelina Center, where hands are the voice." She read the words once, then twice, and one hand rose to cover her mouth. When she turned to find him, Philippe was already standing there in the pool of sunlight filling the room. He raised both hands, and before the old man who had served 2 generations of the Ferraro family and the old woman who had poured Haven tea for 8 years, 2 quiet figures standing at the threshold, like witnesses to a wedding no one had announced. The most feared man in New York began to sign, slowly and carefully. "For 15 years, I kept a room locked because I was afraid to remember. Then you appeared carrying the very thing I had buried, and you brought it back to life in the middle of a banquet hall. Haven, all my life, people have feared my voice. They fall silent when I enter a room, answer when I ask a question, and beg when I pass judgment. But you're the first person who has ever made me want silence, because silence beside you is the most peaceful thing I've ever known. So I didn't come here to thank you, and I didn't come to apologize. I came to ask you one question." His hands paused for a moment, and for the first time, Haven saw them tremble. Then they finished the sentence. "Will you stay? Stay with this room, with the children who will one day fill every seat in it, and with me." Haven stood motionless, tears already slipping down her cheeks before she could stop them. But she didn't lift her hands to sign an answer. She did something else. She opened the cloth bag hanging at her side, took out the chipped tin box, lifted the lid, removed the silver swallow, and with fingers that didn't tremble at all, pinned it neatly and securely to the lapel of her coat, in the exact place where her teacher had once worn it every Tuesday afternoon. Then she raised her eyes to him, and Philippe understood that some answers need no language at all, among all the languages known to humankind. He stepped forward. She stepped forward. In the middle of that sunlit room, he lowered his forehead against hers, his large hands finding her smaller ones, their fingers weaving together in the simplest and oldest language of all. At the doorway, Pearl drew out a handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes, while Franco, the old man who had once turned away in the banquet hall that autumn, didn't turn away this time. He stood straight and watched the 2 young people in the pool of sunlight, allowing his aging eyes to fill with tears, because he knew that somewhere, his old master and the woman who had worn the swallow had finally been given the chance to see what they had been waiting for. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning at the beginning of winter, the wooden sign had been mounted above the entrance of the old brick building, and the door that had remained locked for so many years now stood wide open to welcome its first visitors. More than a dozen children from the Brooklyn neighborhood filled the rows of new desks, their small faces eager yet shy. Some had been hearing impaired since birth, while others had only recently lost their hearing after an illness, just like a 12-year-old girl from 15 years earlier. Standing at the front of the classroom in a simple sweater, with the silver swallow pinned neatly to her lapel, Haven raised both hands and began the first lesson, slowly and patiently teaching the children the first signs of their lives, exactly as someone had once knelt in the corner of a classroom and taught her. Pearl sat in a chair beside the window, with a pot of tea she had brought over from the diner, occasionally lifting the hem of her wool sweater to dab at her eyes before laughing softly at herself. In the last row of the classroom, Philippe Ferraro sat quietly with a cup of cold coffee in his hand, and though no one said a word, Franco suddenly realized from his place in the doorway that his young master was sitting in the exact corner where, every Tuesday afternoon long ago, the old master had once sat in silence and watched his wife teach. Halfway through the lesson, the smallest girl in the class suddenly left her seat, ran to the front, and gently tugged at her teacher's sweater. With her tiny hands still awkward and uncertain, she signed a brief sentence. "You're a good teacher. I like this very much." Then she ran back to her seat with a smile missing one front tooth, and Haven stood motionless for a heartbeat, having to turn toward the window for a moment before she could continue the lesson, because there are simple words of gratitude a person may wait an entire lifetime to receive. At the end of the class, after the children had rushed outside to join their parents, Franco walked over to Philippe, who stood watching Haven return each chair carefully to its place. The old man rested a hand on his young master's shoulder, and finally spoke the words he had carried inside himself for 3 weeks. If your father were still alive, he wouldn't say much. He was a man of few words, just like you. He would only look at this room, look at that girl, then look at you and say one thing. At last, you've come home. 1 week later, a handwritten letter arrived at Philippe's office. It was from Trevor Ashford, written from somewhere far beyond New York, asking permission to return and testify before the federal prosecutor, so that he might atone for his part in what had happened. But that is a story for another time. Our story today will end here, inside that sunlit classroom. And ladies and gentlemen, if you have traveled with this story all the way to this moment, then perhaps you have also recognized what one humble Brooklyn waitress taught the 6 most powerful families in New York, that the true disability was never found in the person who couldn't hear. It lived in those who possessed perfectly good ears yet refused to listen, in those who had eyes yet looked straight through other human beings as though they were panes of glass. Respecting another person is not always some grand or heroic act. Sometimes it is only turning toward them, looking directly into their eyes, and waiting patiently while they speak in the language that belongs to them. And there is one more truth. Like the room that powerful man kept locked for 15 years, the part of ourselves we bury to please other people, to appear strong, to seem acceptable, may be the most beautiful and most deserving part of us to live. Don't wait until your life is nearly over before you find the courage to open that door. We don't know how this story has made you feel. Perhaps you have met someone like Haven, or someone like Pearl, or perhaps you too have kept a room locked somewhere inside your heart for many years. Please share what you feel from the deepest part of your heart in the comments below. We truly hope to hear every one of your stories, because each comment is a small light that helps stories of kindness travel farther. If today's story touched your heart, please like this video and share it with someone you believe needs to hear it most. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that each day you can hear more meaningful stories about humanity, kindness, and the goodness that still exists all around us. We sincerely wish you and your family abundant health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and lasting serenity within your hearts. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.